Marie Curie, a sleep story. There is a city in the north of Europe where the winters arrive early and stay long, where the snow comes in October and remains until April, lying deep and white and silent over the rooftops and the courtyards and the wide stone streets, and where the cold is not merely a temperature but a presence, a quality of the air that sharpens everything it touches, that makes the outlines of buildings stand out very clearly against the pale grey sky, that makes the breath visible as a small soft cloud in front of the face, and that fills the lungs with a clean, cold clarity that is, in its own way, a kind of gift. This city is Warsaw, the capital of Poland, and it is here, on the 7th of November in the year 1867, in a modest apartment in the New World Street not far from the center of the city, that a child was born who would be given the name Maria, and who would carry that name quietly through a childhood of cold winters and warm kitchens and the smell of chalk dust and old books, before carrying it out into the larger world and eventually exchanging it, in a French accent, for the name by which she would become known to history, the name Marie. The apartment in Warsaw was a teacher's apartment, which meant that it was full of books and of the particular kind of orderly seriousness that people who care very much about learning bring to the organization of their domestic spaces. Her father, Władysław Sklodowski, was a teacher of mathematics and physics at a secondary school, a gentle and thoughtful man who wore his glasses pushed up on his forehead when he was thinking and who had the habit of reading at the dinner table when he thought he could get away with it, and who believed, with a quiet and unshakable conviction, that the life of the mind was the most important life a person could live, that the pursuit of knowledge was not a luxury but a necessity, and that this pursuit was equally available to and equally important for his daughters as for his sons. Her mother, Bronislawa, had been the director of a school for girls before her health began to fail, a woman of great warmth and equal intellectual seriousness, who taught her children their letters and their numbers at the same table where she corrected her students' papers, who filled their early years with the same density of learning and affection that characterized everything she did. Maria was the youngest of 5 children, the last to arrive in the apartment on New World Street, and she grew up surrounded by the gentle noise and warmth of a family that was, despite the difficulties of their circumstances, deeply attached to each other and deeply committed to the life of the mind. There is a quality that only certain childhoods have, a quality of density and warmth that comes when the people in a household genuinely care about each other and genuinely care about ideas, when the dinner table is a place for both food and conversation, when the books are read and then discussed and then read again, when the children grow up understanding that thinking is not a task assigned by school but a pleasure pursued for its own sake, a pleasure available at any hour of the day and worth staying up past bedtime to pursue. This was the quality of the Sklodowski household, and it was a gift that Maria carried with her for the rest of her life, the deep conviction, learned before she was old enough to question it, that the life of the mind was not a specialty but a natural human condition, not something separate from the warmth and the feeling of a family but continuous with it, woven into the fabric of the ordinary day. The winters of Warsaw that Maria grew up in had a particular and memorable quality, a quality of enclosure and of concentration, as if the cold and the dark and the snow pressing in from outside created inside the apartment a warmth that was more than merely physical, a warmth of closeness and shared purpose that might not have been so vivid in a milder climate. The family gathered in the evenings around the kitchen table, and the lamp made its circle of light on the oilcloth, and her father read, and the fire in the stove kept its steady warmth against the cold outside. And in this enclosure Maria did her homework and read her books and listened to her siblings and her father talk, and gradually absorbed, through the pause of her attention, the particular atmosphere of serious warmth that would always, for her, be the ideal condition for work and thought. The smell of a Warsaw winter evening, inside the apartment on New World Street, was the smell of pine resin from the wood stove and the lamp oil burning low and the leather of the book bindings and the particular dry dusty smell of chalk that her father always carried from his teaching, and beneath all of these the smell of the food that her mother and then, after her mother died, her older sisters prepared for dinner, warming in the pot on the back of the stove. A smell of cabbage and bread and the strong black tea that the family drank from tall glasses with a piece of sugar held between the teeth in the Polish way, the sweetness arriving slowly through the tea rather than dissolved into it, a small and deliberate pleasure in a life that was managed with great care and some austerity. These sensory details of the Warsaw childhood were things that Maria carried with her without knowing she was carrying them, the way all of us carry the textures and smells and sounds of the places where we first became ourselves, carry them not as memories we can choose to retrieve but as a kind of atmospheric ground, a sense of what familiar feels like, what warmth feels like, what safety feels like, what the right conditions for thinking and learning feel like. And later, in the cold rented room in Paris, when she made herself a cup of the strong black tea that she had never stopped preferring, there would be something in the taste of it that was not just tea but Warsaw, not just warmth but all the warmth of all the evenings by the lamp with the books open and the cold outside and the family close. And this quiet continuity between the child and the woman she became was one of the things that sustained her through the years when sustaining was required. Her brother Joseph and her sisters Sophia and Bronislawa and Helena were all around her in those early years, and the apartment, though modest, was full of the sounds of learning, the sound of lessons being practiced, of mathematics being worked through at the kitchen table, of history and literature and science being discussed in the evenings by the firelight, of the piano that stood in the sitting room and that someone was almost always playing, filling the apartment with music that drifted through the rooms and out into the cold Warsaw air. The Poland in which Maria Sklodowska grew up was not a free country. It was, in the second half of the 19th century, divided among Russia, Prussia, and Austria, with Warsaw falling under Russian control, and the Russian administration had imposed restrictions on Polish culture and education that were severe and deeply felt by a people who took their national identity and their intellectual tradition very seriously. The teaching of Polish history and Polish literature was forbidden in the official schools, and the Russian language was imposed in its place, and this suppression, which was intended to wear away Polish identity over time, had instead produced, in people like Władysław Sklodowski, a fierce and private determination to keep the culture alive, to teach the children in secret what they could not be taught in public, to make of the home a place where Polish history and Polish poetry and Polish science were honored and preserved and passed on. Maria absorbed all of this from the beginning, the love of learning and the love of Poland and the particular quality of serious joy that her father brought to the teaching of mathematics and physics, the sense that the natural world was a place of genuine wonder, that the laws that governed it were not merely useful but beautiful, that to understand them was one of the most satisfying things a human mind could do. She was a precocious child in the most genuine sense, not precocious in the performing way that some children are, not showing off what she knew but simply unable to keep from engaging fully with every intellectual challenge that came her way, solving the problems before her older siblings had finished reading them, reading the books on her father's shelves before anyone thought to suggest them to her, absorbing knowledge the way a dry sponge absorbs water, quickly and completely and with an evident satisfaction that was deeply pleasing to watch. The particular winters of Warsaw in the 1870s, in the years of Maria's childhood, were winters that settled in early and stayed long, winters that filled the streets with snow and the air with a cold so clean and absolute that it seemed almost like a substance in itself, a presence that clarified everything it touched. That made the outlines of the building stand out very sharply against the white sky and made the sound of footsteps in the snow carry a great distance in the still air. She walked to school in this cold with her brothers and sisters, the 5 of them moving through the early morning streets with their breath-making clouds in the air before them, and the school day was punctuated by the sound of the stove in the corner of the classroom working against the cold outside, and in the afternoons the return home through the same streets, now marked with the tracks of the day's traffic, the snow tramped down and beginning to show the gray of the street surface beneath. School was a pleasure that never diminished. She was, from the first, the kind of student who makes teaching a joy, attentive and quick and genuinely eager for the material, never performing interest but always feeling it, never doing the minimum required but always going further, reading ahead and asking questions that the lessons had not yet reached and making connections between subjects that the curriculum treated as entirely separate. Her teachers noted her, remembered her, were in some cases changed by the experience of teaching someone whose desire to learn was so clearly genuine and so clearly boundless, and the gold medal she received at her graduation was not a surprise to anyone who had taught her but simply the formal acknowledgement of what had been obvious for years. She learned to read very early, younger than any of her siblings, and reading became for her what it becomes for some people, a fundamental mode of being in the world, a way of being simultaneously inside her own life and inside the lives and thoughts of others, of being simultaneously in Warsaw in the cold winter and in every other place and time that the books on her father's shelves made accessible. She read everything, the mathematics texts and the science books and the history and the poetry, reading with the same quality of focused absorption she brought to everything, and the world that the books opened up for her was enormous and luminous and full of the same kind of wonder that she found in the natural world when she looked carefully at the frost patterns on the windows in winter or the way the ice on the river cracked and shifted in the first days of spring thaw. Her childhood, though it contained real grief, had the quality of warmth and intellectual richness that a loving and learned family can create even in circumstances that are far from easy. Her mother died of tuberculosis when Maria was 10 years old, a loss that was profound and that left a quietness in the apartment that had not been there before, a sadness that did not go away but that, in the way of families that love each other, was gradually absorbed into the texture of daily life rather than allowed to become its defining feature. Her father, though grieving, continued to be present and attentive, continued to read at the dinner table and push his glasses up on his forehead when he was thinking and to fill the apartment with the sound and the substance of learning, and the children, drawing together in the way that children draw together around a shared loss, became even closer to each other in the years following their mother's death. The winters of Maria's Warsaw childhood were long and cold and, in the way of winters everywhere, conducive to interiority, to the kind of deep and concentrated attention that is harder to maintain when the world outside is warm and full of invitation. She would sit at the kitchen table in the evenings with her father's physics textbooks open in front of her and the lamp making a warm circle of light on the pages and the frost building on the windows and the sounds of the city muffled by the snow outside, and she would work through the problems with a patience and a thoroughness that was already entirely characteristic, going back and back to anything she did not fully understand until she understood it, not satisfied with an approximate grasp of a principle but needing to hold it completely, to turn it around in her mind from every angle until it was fully clear, until she could see not just how it worked but why, not just the formula but the thing the formula was describing. She graduated from the gymnasium, the secondary school, at the top of her class, receiving the gold medal that was the highest honor given to graduates, and she received it at the age of 15, a year younger than most of her classmates, which was a fact that was noted by her teachers with a mixture of admiration and, perhaps, a slight unease. For a girl of such evident intellectual capacity presented certain complications in a society that had not yet arranged itself to accommodate what she clearly was and clearly needed. The universities of Warsaw were, at this time, closed to women. The Russian administration that governed Poland had not seen fit to open higher education to women, and the Polish academic institutions that operated under Russian oversight had no choice but to follow the same policy. Maria could not, having finished her secondary schooling with the highest possible distinction, simply proceed to the university in Warsaw and study the physics and mathematics that were clearly her calling. She had to find another way. The way she found, and the way it was found for her by her older sister Bronislawa, who was in the same situation and faced it with the same determination, was the floating university, a clandestine institution of higher learning that operated in Warsaw in the 1880s and 90s under conditions of considerable secrecy, meeting in private apartments and changing its location regularly to avoid detection by the Russian authorities, offering courses in science and mathematics and literature and history to the young Polish women who came to it hungry for the education that the official institutions denied them. The floating university was a remarkable thing, a proof that the desire to learn is strong enough to find a way around almost any obstacle, and it was there, in borrowed parlors and rented rooms, that Maria Sklodowska first encountered the kind of serious scientific education that she had been preparing herself for all her conscious life. The arrangement that she and Bronislawa worked out together was a model of practical solidarity between sisters who understood each other's needs and trusted each other absolutely. Bronislawa wanted to study medicine in Paris, where the universities were open to women, but she did not have the money. Maria agreed to work as a governess in the country, sending a portion of her wages to Bronislawa every month to support her studies in Paris, and Bronislawa in turn agreed that when she had finished her own degree and established herself, she would support Maria in Paris so that Maria could study in her turn. This arrangement was arrived at quietly and without drama, as practical necessities are when the people involved are fundamentally sensible and fundamentally loving toward each other, and it was honored by both parties with the same quiet faithfulness with which they had honored every other commitment in their lives. So Maria went to work as a governess, first in Warsaw and then in the countryside north of the city, in a village called Szuki, where she taught the children of a land-owning family named Zorowski and spent 5 years in a state of considerable intellectual longing, maintaining her own education in the evenings after the children were in bed, studying mathematics from textbooks she had brought with her, corresponding with her father and with Bronislawa, and waiting, with the patience that was already one of her defining qualities, for her turn to come. The years in the country gave Maria something that the city had not been able to give her, a relationship with the natural world at the scale and pace of the natural world itself, a relationship not mediated by the paving stones and the buildings and the organized distances of a city but immediate and unfiltered. The sky directly overhead and the fields directly underfoot and the seasons moving through the landscape with a visibility and a completeness that the city's urgency tends to obscure. She learned, in those years, to read the weather from the shapes of clouds and the feel of the wind, to distinguish the particular quality of the light in the hour before a storm from the light of an ordinary overcast day, to notice the difference in the sound of the wind through the birch trees at different seasons, the thin dry sound of November and the full and sighing sound of July, and all of these observations, made without any scientific purpose and without any expectation of their usefulness, were nevertheless adding to the deep fund of careful looking that would make her the scientist she became. She also read, in those country years, with the systematic thoroughness of a person conducting an education in the absence of any institution to conduct it for them. She read the physics and mathematics that were her primary interests, working through the textbooks that her father sent her by post, but she also read more widely, history and literature and natural philosophy, reading in the way that the best readers always read, not to accumulate information but to build understanding, not to be able to report what she had read but to allow it to become part of how she thought, part of the landscape of her mind against which new ideas could be measured and in relation to which they could find their meaning. The landscape around Shuki, flat and wide and full of the particular silence of the Polish countryside in winter, when the snow lay deep over the fields and the birch trees stood bare and pale against the grey sky, was a landscape that asked for patience, that rewarded the kind of extended and quiet attention that a restless person could not sustain, but that was entirely natural to Maria. She would walk in this landscape on her days off, walking long distances along the field paths and the frozen canal banks, watching the sky and the light and the birds that moved through the winter air in small purposeful flocks, and these walks were both exercise and reflection, both the body moving in the cold air and the mind moving through the problems it was working on. The two kinds of movement complementary and sustaining each other in the way that physical and intellectual activity sustain each other when they are both engaged at the right level of effort and attention. The years in the country were not wasted years, though they were certainly years of restriction and longing. She taught herself as much as she could from the books available to her, working through higher mathematics in the evenings by lamplight with the same focused patience she had brought to her secondary schoolwork, and she also taught, in the tradition of her family and the floating university, the peasant children of the village who had no other access to education, teaching them to read Polish history and Polish literature in secret, an act that was both generous and quietly dangerous in Russian-controlled Poland, an act that connected her to the long tradition of her family's resistance to the suppression of Polish culture. The landscape of the countryside around Shuki, the flat fields and the broad sky and the birch forests that stood in long pale lines at the edges of the fields, was very different from the city landscape of Warsaw, and Maria, who had grown up in the city, found in the open countryside a kind of spaciousness that was new to her experience, a sense of scale and distance that was both humbling and freeing. She walked in the fields in the evenings when the light was long and golden and the shadows of the birch trees lay across the grass in thin parallel lines, and she watched the weather come across the flat horizon with a slowness and a visibility that was impossible in the city, the clouds building from small and innocent shapes into enormous grey structures that moved across the sky with a stately patience and delivered their rain or their snow with an indifference to human plans that was, in its own way, instructive. It was in these country years that Maria also fell in love with the eldest son of the Żurowski family, a young man named Kazimierz, who was a mathematics student and who shared her intellectual interests and who seems to have genuinely returned her affection. But the Żurowski family did not consent to the match. Their son could not marry a governess, a girl without money or social standing, however gifted she might be, and the young man, who perhaps did not yet have the strength of character that would have been required to go against his family's wishes, allowed the relationship to end, and Maria experienced this as the kind of pain that comes from the intersection of love and practicality, the pain of a world that places conditions on feeling that feeling itself does not recognize. She recovered, as people do, gradually and thoroughly, and she returned to Warsaw, and then, in 1891, at the age of 23, she finally made the journey that she had been waiting for through all those years of governessing and teaching and patient self-education, the journey to Paris, to the Sorbonne, to the laboratory and the library and the lecture hall that were waiting for her, that had always, in some sense, been waiting for her. The journey from Warsaw to Paris, by train through Germany and into France, was in those days a journey of many hours, and Maria would have sat at the window and watched the landscape change from the flat Polish plain to the rolling hills of Germany to the gentle river valleys of France, watching with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, noticing the way the light changed as she moved west and south, the way the vegetation became denser and more varied, the way the villages looked different, the stone different, the roof lines different, everything telling her that she was moving into a new world, a world that she had prepared for and imagined for years, and that was now actually around her, real and solid and full of possibility. Paris in 1891 was the most exciting city in the world. It was a city in the process of becoming modern, a city where the great boulevards that Haussmann had driven through the old medieval tangle were still relatively new, and where the cafes and the department stores and the new apartment buildings that lined them were full of the particular energy of a city that is conscious of itself, that knows it is at the center of things. The Eiffel Tower had been built just 2 years earlier for the World's Fair and still stood, slightly controversial, over the rooftops of the city. The city was lit by both gas and electricity, the new and the old coexisting in the streets with the same easy tolerance that Paris brought to most things. The trains ran underground, and the painters worked in studios in Montmartre, and the scientists worked in laboratories at the Sorbonne and the École Normale Supérieure, and the whole city hummed with the energy of a place that is actively becoming what it is going to be. Maria enrolled at the Sorbonne as a student of physics, one of only a handful of women in the science faculty, and she threw herself into the work with the intensity of someone who has waited a very long time for this moment and is determined to make full use of every hour of it. She rented a small room in the Latin Quarter, not far from the university, a room that was cold in winter and hot in summer, and that had almost nothing in it except the books and the lamp and the small stove that she sometimes remembered to light and sometimes forgot, absorbed in her work. She lived on very little money, eating simply and cheaply, sometimes forgetting to eat at all when she was deep in a problem, and she worked with a concentration and a duration that alarmed those around her and sustained her through the years of study with a kind of fierce joy that she could feel in her body as well as in her mind. The lectures at the Sorbonne were given by some of the most distinguished scientists in France, and Maria attended all of them, sitting near the front where she could hear and see clearly, taking notes in the careful and economical hand that she had developed over years of practice, following the arguments with the close and active attention of someone who is not merely recording information but processing it immediately, testing it against what she already knows, asking herself where it confirms and where it challenges and where it opens new questions that she had not thought to ask before. After the lectures she would go to the library and continue working, or to the laboratory where she was beginning to learn the practical skills of experimental science, the careful and patient work of setting up an apparatus and taking measurements and checking and rechecking the results, the work that requires not just intelligence but a quality of sustained and unhurried precision that she was constitutionally suited for. The Latin Quarter in the 1890s was a neighborhood of students and scholars, a neighborhood whose streets were narrow and whose buildings were old and whose cafes were full at all hours of people arguing and talking about everything at once. Maria moved through this neighborhood with the particular quality of absorption that characterized her throughout her life, not unaware of what was around her but not distracted by it either, present to the world she was passing through at the same time as she was present to the work she was thinking about, the problems in mechanics and thermodynamics that she was working through in the lectures and that she continued working through as she walked, the equations and the principles arranging themselves in her mind against the background of the city with its lamplit streets and its chestnuts in flower in the spring and its cold fogs in November rolling in from the Seine and softening the outlines of the old buildings into shapes that seemed both more substantial and more mysterious. In the early mornings, before the lectures began, she would go to the library and sit at a long table near a window where the light was good and work for an hour or two before the reading rooms filled with other students, and these early morning hours in the library were among the best hours of her Paris years, the library quiet and the light coming through the tall windows in long clear bars and the books open in front of her and the sense of the day being entirely available. The whole long Paris day ahead full of the lectures and the laboratory work and the conversations with other students and the evenings of reading and problem solving that together made up the fabric of a life that was, for all its material simplicity, as rich as a life could be. She also spent time, in these years, in the company of other students from Poland, other young men and women who had come to Paris for the education that Warsaw could not provide, who gathered in the evenings in rented rooms and talked about science and philosophy and the future of Poland and the future of the world. A community of shared exile and shared ambition that was warm and sustaining even when the conversations were heated and the disagreements were real. Maria was not by nature a gregarious person, was happiest in solitude or in very small company, but she understood the value of these gatherings, the way ideas develop faster in dialogue than in isolation, the way other minds provide the friction and the challenge that prevents a single mind from becoming too comfortable with its own conclusions. She took her license in physics in 1893, finishing first in her class, and the following year she took her second degree, in mathematics, again with distinction, and by this time she was 26 years old and in possession of qualifications that most of her male classmates had not achieved, and she was beginning to think about research, about the questions at the edge of what was known that she might spend her scientific life exploring. She had also, in the spring of 1894, met a man who would become the most important person in her life, a meeting that happened in the quiet way that the most significant meetings often happen, in a laboratory, over a shared interest in the properties of magnetized steel, in a conversation that began professionally and became, over the following months, something else, something warmer and deeper and more durable. Pierre Curie was 8 years older than Marie, a scientist of considerable reputation who had already done important work on crystals and on the properties of magnetism and who was, by the time they met, a man who had organized his life entirely around his scientific work, who had chosen, consciously and with full awareness of what he was choosing, to dedicate himself to the investigation of the natural world with a completeness that left room for very little else. He was a quiet man, a gentle man, a man who thought carefully before he spoke and who, when he spoke, said exactly what he meant and nothing more. He was also, like Marie, someone who found in the natural world a source of wonder that never diminished, who approached every experiment with the same quality of open and patient attention, who was never too certain about what he would find to be genuinely surprised when the result was different from what he expected. They recognized each other, as people of like natures sometimes do, not immediately or dramatically but gradually, over weeks and months of working in proximity, of conversations that began about science and ranged across the larger questions that science keeps company with. Conversations about the nature of knowledge and the responsibilities of the scientist and the beauty of the natural world and the ways in which a life devoted to understanding it is a good and sufficient life. Marie, who had given her heart once before and had learned from that experience to be careful, was careful. Pierre, who had never been in love before, was patient. And the relationship between them grew slowly, the way that things grow in cold climates grow, thoroughly and with great staying power, putting down roots that went very deep. They were married in the summer of 1895, in a ceremony that was quiet and without religious ceremony, in keeping with both their natures and their views, and they began their life together in a small apartment near the school where Pierre taught, an apartment that was simply furnished and full of books and scientific papers, an apartment that was, in every important sense, a continuation of the laboratory, the place where the work of the day was reflected on and refined and where the questions of tomorrow's work were gradually assembled. The work that would make them famous had not yet begun. They were, in these early years of their marriage, two scientists in early middle age, doing solid and respected work in their fields, living quietly and working hard and building the daily fabric of a life together that was, by all evidence, genuinely and deeply happy. Marie cooked, in a practical and efficient rather than elaborate way, and Pierre tended a small garden behind the apartment with the same patient attention he gave to his laboratory work, and in the evenings they read to each other and talked about the work and sometimes went out on bicycles through the Paris streets and out into the countryside, which they both loved and which offered them, in the hours away from the laboratory, the same kind of renewal that the natural world had always offered both of them, the return to the scale and pace of the world that existed before human urgency imposed itself on it. Their daughter Irene was born in September of 1897, a fact that altered the rhythm of their life in the ways that new children always alter the rhythm of their parents' lives, introducing a new scale of time into the household, the slow time of an infant's needs and growth, the time measured not in experiments completed or papers written but in feedings and sleeps, and the first tentative focusing of a new set of eyes on the world. Marie, who was determined to be both a scientist and a mother, managed both with the same systematic competence that she brought to everything, though it was not always easy, and the help of Pierre's father, Dr. Curie, who came to live with them and who was deeply fond of Irene, made the management of these competing demands considerably more possible. It was also in 1897 that Marie began the research that would define her scientific life. She was looking for a topic for her doctoral thesis, the first such thesis by a woman in France, and she chose to investigate a recently discovered phenomenon that had intrigued her since she first read about it the previous year, the phenomenon that Henri Becquerel had stumbled upon in 1896, the strange property of uranium salts by which they seem to emit rays spontaneously, without any external source of energy, rays that could expose a photographic plate and ionize the air around them, appearing to come from the uranium itself as a natural and continuous emanation. The nature of these rays was completely unknown. Whether they were a form of light or a form of electricity or something entirely different, no one could say. The question of where the energy came from, how a piece of uranium could continue to emit these rays without any apparent source of fuel, was entirely open. Marie chose this question as her own, and in making this choice she chose something much larger than she could have known at the time, chose a path that would lead her and Pierre into the discovery of two new elements, into a new understanding of the nature of matter itself, into the Nobel Prize and into history. The laboratory where she did this work was not a proper laboratory at all, but a converted storeroom, a damp and drafty space with an earthen floor and a leaking roof, inadequate heating and inadequate ventilation and equipment that was always either insufficient or broken, a place that a later generation of scientists, used to the gleaming and climate-controlled laboratories of the modern era, would look back on with a mixture of admiration and horror. But Marie worked in it with the patience and the resourcefulness of someone who has learned, from years of experience, that the conditions are never perfect and that waiting for them to become perfect is the same as not doing the work. She made do with what she had. She developed, under the constraints of inadequate equipment, a method of measuring the ionization of air by uranium with extraordinary precision, a method that would allow her, over the following months and years, to compare the ionizing capacity of different uranium-containing materials with a reliability and a sensitivity that had not been achieved before. What she found, in the careful and systematic measurement of those first months, was something unexpected. The ionizing power of uranium-containing minerals was, in some cases, greater than could be explained by their uranium content alone. Pitchblende, a mineral that contained uranium among other things, was more radioactive, as she was beginning to call it, than pure uranium itself, which could only mean one thing: that pitchblende contained some other substance, some unknown element or elements, that were themselves radioactive, that were emitting these mysterious rays as a property of their own nature, whatever that nature turned out to be. She told Pierre what she had found, and Pierre, who had been working on his own research, immediately set aside what he was doing and joined her, because he understood, as she understood, that what she had found was not a small thing, that the systematic exploration of this unexpected result would require more than one pair of hands and more than one mind, and that the result, if it held up, was of the first importance. They worked together on the problem from early 1898, and by December of that year they were in a position to announce to the French Academy of Sciences, in a paper presented by their colleague Henri Becquerel on their behalf, that they had evidence for the existence not of one but of two new elements, elements that were responsible for the anomalous radioactivity of pitchblende, elements to which Marie had given names. One of them polonium, named for her homeland Poland, the country of the suppressed and beloved culture that had shaped her from birth, and the other radium. The announcement was received with interest and with some skepticism, as announcements of new elements always were, and the skepticism was not unreasonable, because Marie and Pierre had as yet only indirect evidence for the existence of radium and polonium, evidence from the pattern of radioactivity in the materials they had studied, not the direct evidence of a substance isolated and characterized and weighed. To provide that direct evidence, to actually isolate radium as a pure compound and demonstrate its atomic weight, would require the processing of enormous quantities of pitchblende, because the concentration of radium in pitchblende was extraordinarily small, fractions of a gram per ton, and to obtain enough radium to characterize chemically would mean processing tons of material. They did it. Over the next 4 years, from 1899 to 1902, working in the same leaking storeroom and then in a larger shed that was not much better, working in conditions of considerable physical hardship, breathing the dust and fumes of the chemical processing, stirring enormous vats of dissolving pitchblende with iron rods in a space that was barely heated in winter and insufferably hot in summer. They processed ton after ton of pitchblende residue that they obtained from a mine in Bohemia, and gradually, Through a long and painstaking process of chemical separation and refinement, they concentrated the radium into fractions of increasing purity, and on the 26th of December 1902, Marie finally had in her possession a fraction of a gram of radium chloride that was pure enough to characterize. Pure enough to show that radium was indeed a new element with an atomic weight of approximately 225. These years of processing and refining were years of great physical effort and considerable beauty, in the peculiar way that dedicated and important work is always beautiful. Marie described them later as the happiest years of her scientific life, which is a remarkable thing to say about years of physical hardship and inadequate facilities and the uncertain outcome of an enormous experiment. But it makes perfect sense if you understand that what she was describing was not the comfort of the years but the quality of the engagement, the state of being utterly absorbed in something genuinely important, of working with a person she loved and trusted completely, of living inside a question that was answerable, that was yielding, slowly and faithfully, to the patient and systematic application of intelligence and effort. The shed in the Rue Lomond where they processed the pitch blende was a place of considerable physical discomfort and considerable spiritual intensity, a place that was, depending on the weather and the phase of the work, alternately freezing and suffocating, damp and dusty and full of the chemical fumes that the processing produced, a place that visitors described with a mixture of amazement and alarm. Amazed that serious scientific work was being done in such conditions and alarmed that the people doing it seemed entirely unbothered by the conditions, seemed to find in the difficulty a kind of additional proof of the importance of the work, as if the hardship were part of the commitment and the commitment were proof of the seriousness. Marie worked in this shed with an endurance and a focus that came from the deep conviction that what she was looking for was really there, that the anomalous radioactivity of the pitch blende was real and its cause was findable and the finding of it was worth whatever effort it required. This conviction was not stubbornness and it was not wishful thinking but was something more reliable than either, a scientific judgment based on the evidence of her own measurements taken with great care and checked and rechecked, the evidence that something in the pitch blende beyond the uranium was producing ionizing radiation and that this something had all the characteristics of a real element and none of the characteristics of a measurement error. She trusted her evidence because she trusted her methods, and she trusted her methods because she had built them herself with the most exacting care. The processing itself was laborious in a way that is difficult to fully imagine, involving the dissolving of ton quantities of pitch blende in acid and then the gradual chemical separation of the different components, precipitating one element and then another and setting aside the fraction that remained and redissolving it and separating again. Each cycle producing a slightly more concentrated preparation of the still unknown element, each cycle requiring hours of stirring and heating and filtering and measuring, the work physical and chemical and mathematical all at once, the hands and the mind equally engaged in the patient extraction of the new from the already known. Pierre had given up his own research to help with this project, working alongside her with a devotion that was both scientific and personal, the devotion of a man who understood what she had found and who wanted, as much as she did, to follow it to its conclusion. In the evenings, when the day's processing was done and they had cleaned the equipment and recorded the measurements and locked the shed and walked home through the streets of the Latin Quarter in whatever weather the Paris evening offered, they would eat the simple dinner that Pierre's father had prepared and then sit together at the kitchen table and go over the day's results, comparing the measurements to previous days, discussing what the pattern of the numbers told them about the composition and the character of the element they were chasing, refining their understanding of what it was by eliminating, one by one, what it was not. These evening conversations were the intellectual complement to the physical work of the day, the place where the data became understanding, where the numbers in the notebooks became the story of a new element taking shape in the human mind. The shed in the evening, after the day's processing was done, had a quality that both Marie and Pierre noted with something close to wonder. When they turned off the lamp and stood in the darkness before leaving, the dishes and vials containing their radium concentrations glowed, a faint and beautiful blue-green luminescence, the light that the element emitted spontaneously from its own nature, the light that was itself the mystery they were working to understand, and standing in that dark shed with the glowing dishes around them. They were standing in the visible presence of something that had never been seen by human eyes before. A new element, a new kind of matter, revealing itself through its own light. They received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1903, shared with Henri Becquerel, the first Nobel Prize awarded to a woman, and the award brought with it a kind of fame and attention that was entirely foreign to their natures and entirely disruptive to their work. They did not go to Stockholm to receive the prize, citing Pierre's poor health, and the letters and the visitors and the demands on their time that the prize produced were a source of genuine distress to both of them, because what they wanted, what they had always wanted, was to be left alone to work, to be in the laboratory in the morning with the equipment and the questions and the patient discipline of experiment, and fame was the opposite of that. Fame was interruption and obligation and the performance of a social role that neither of them had any talent for or interest in. Marie had, by this time, completed her doctoral thesis, the first doctorate in science awarded to a woman in France, and she had been awarded it with the highest distinction, and she had also been appointed to Pierre's teaching position at the École de Physique at Chimay when he moved to a new position at the Sorbonne, and she had thus become the first woman to hold a teaching position in physics at a major French university, which was another first among the many firsts that she accumulated. Not by seeking them, but by simply being the most capable person available, by being, in every situation, the person who knew the most and worked the hardest and thought the most clearly. The years between the first Nobel Prize and the catastrophe of 1906 were years of settled and productive happiness. They worked, they raised Irene, who was by now a sturdy and independent child with her mother's combination of seriousness and warmth. They spent holidays in the countryside that they both loved, cycling through Normandy or Brittany or Provence, moving through the French landscape at the slow and personal pace of people on bicycles, close to the ground, aware of the air and the light and the changing quality of the countryside. And these holidays were genuinely restoring, genuinely renewing. The outward world offering the same thing it had always offered Marie from the time she was a child, watching the frost on the Warsaw windows, an inexhaustible supply of things worth paying attention to. The bicycles were central to these holidays in a way that went beyond mere transportation. To travel by bicycle is to move through the world at a pace that is fast enough to cover real distances but slow enough to see everything along the way, to smell the hedgerows and feel the temperature change as you descend into a valley or climb onto an exposed hillside, to hear the birds and the wind and the sound of water before you see the stream, to be entirely in the landscape rather than merely passing through it. Marie and Pierre were both tireless cyclists and genuinely happy in movement, happy in the physical exertion and the clean air and the way the countryside unrolled in front of them at the pace of their own effort, and the holidays they spent cycling through Brittany or the Auvergne or the Loire Valley were days that both of them would look back on as among the best days of their lives. Days of uncomplicated wholeness in which the body and the mind and the natural world were all in alignment. All moving at the same pace, all oriented in the same direction. In the evenings of these cycling holidays they would stop at a small inn in whatever village they had reached at the end of the day's riding, eating the local food and drinking the local wine with the unself-conscious pleasure of people who have been outdoors all day and are genuinely hungry and genuinely tired and genuinely glad to be sitting still, and they would talk, as they always talked, about the work and about the questions and about the world. And these conversations, freed from the pressure of the laboratory and the constraints of professional life, ranged more widely and more speculatively than the conversations of the working week, following their curiosity wherever it led without the need to justify or conclude, and this freedom was itself a form of renewal, the kind of intellectual rest that is not the absence of thinking but thinking without urgency, thinking that can be abandoned or resumed at will, thinking that serves no purpose except its own pleasure. Pierre was killed on the 19th of April 1906, struck by a horse-drawn cart on the Rue Dauphine in Paris on a rainy afternoon. He had been distracted, perhaps, or simply unlucky, and the wheel of the cart passed over his head, and he died immediately, and Marie's world, which had been built so carefully and so lovingly over 11 years of marriage, collapsed. The grief she felt was of the kind that does not resolve but must simply be carried, the grief of losing not just a person but a way of being in the world, a way of thinking and working and loving that had been so completely shared that the loss of the other person is not only the loss of their presence but the loss of a fundamental aspect of yourself, the loss of the person in whose company you were most fully who you were. She wrote to her father and to her sister and to the few close friends she had, and the letters have survived, and they are documents of the most profound grief written in the most controlled and measured language, the language of a person who knows that the only way through enormous pain is the same patient and systematic way through every other problem, one step at a time, without drama, without surrender. She went back to the laboratory. This was not, as some have suggested, a flight from grief into work, but something more considered than that, something more like the recognition that the work was the truest thing she had, the most continuous thread between the person she had been and the person she would need to become, the thing that Pierre had loved alongside her and that she could best honor by continuing. She went back to the laboratory because it was where she needed to be, where the questions were still waiting that they had been working on together, where the equipment was still set up and the notebooks were still open to the pages where they had both been writing, and where the world was still, as it had always been, full of things worth understanding. She was appointed to fill Pierre's position at the Sorbonne, becoming the first woman to hold a professorship there, and on the 5th of November 1906 she gave her first lecture in that role, arriving at the lecture hall at 1:30 in the afternoon to find it packed beyond capacity, filled with students and journalists and members of the public who had come, some out of genuine scientific interest, some out of curiosity about this unprecedented woman, some simply because the moment was clearly historic and they wanted to be present for it. Marie entered the hall quietly, walked to the lectern without looking at the audience, and began her lecture precisely where Pierre had left off his last lecture, as if to say that the work was continuous, that it did not belong to one person but to the questions themselves, that science was not the property of any individual but the collective and ongoing project of human understanding. The lecture hall was silent as she spoke, the silence of a large room full of people who are all paying close attention at the same moment, and her voice was steady and clear and entirely professional, the voice of a scientist describing the current state of her field to students who needed to understand it, and if there were people in the room who were moved to the edge of tears by the composure and the courage of it, that was between them and themselves and not something that Marie acknowledged or perhaps even noticed, being too entirely present in what she was doing to be aware of how it appeared from the outside. She continued to give those lectures for many years, and they became known for their clarity and their precision and the quality of concentrated attention that she brought to the exposition of difficult material, the way she could take a concept that seemed abstract and make it concrete by connecting it to the experimental evidence on which it rested, the way she never asked her students to accept a result on authority but always showed them the path by which the result had been reached, the way she made scientific knowledge feel not like a finished edifice but like a process still in motion, still being built, still offering room for new contributions and new questions. Students who studied with her reported, in later years, that what she had given them was not just knowledge but a way of knowing, a practice of attention and precision and intellectual honesty that remained with them long after the specific content of the lectures had faded. The laboratory at the Sorbonne and then at the Radium Institute was a place she created with great care and sustained with great dedication, a place where the physical conditions of the work were taken seriously, where the instruments were maintained with scrupulous attention, where the records were kept with complete and reliable accuracy, where the culture of the laboratory reflected the values of the person who directed it, the values of precision and honesty and the willingness to follow the evidence wherever it led, even when it led away from the result that would have been most convenient or most satisfying. In 1911, she was awarded a second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry, for her discovery of radium and polonium and her isolation of radium as a pure element, becoming the first person to receive 2 Nobel Prizes and the first person to receive them in 2 different scientific disciplines. The award was not without controversy. The year 1911 was a difficult year for Marie, a year in which her private life had become, in ways she had not chosen and could not prevent, a subject of public discussion, a year in which the French press and parts of the academic community had treated her with a mixture of admiration and hostility that was deeply painful and deeply unjust. And the Nobel Committee's decision to award her the prize in this particular year was an act of recognition that went beyond the scientific to something more personal and more important, a statement that the work stood on its own terms, that the quality of the discovery was not diminished by the quality of the gossip. The laboratory in Paris grew over the years. Marie fought, with the same patient persistence she brought to every other obstacle, for better funding and better facilities, for the resources that serious scientific work required, and gradually she obtained them, and by the time of the First World War she was directing a laboratory of considerable size and importance, with students and researchers from many countries working under her supervision. The war brought new demands on the laboratory and on Marie herself. She developed mobile X-ray units, the famous petites Curies, small vehicles equipped with X-ray equipment that she drove herself to the field hospitals near the front, training technicians and performing X-rays on wounded soldiers, working through her own physical exhaustion with the same capacity for sustained effort that had characterized everything she had done since the first experiments in the leaking storeroom. Irene, her daughter, worked alongside her in these wartime years, a young woman of remarkable competence and dedication who had inherited from both her parents the combination of intellectual rigor and practical capability that characterized the best scientists, and watching her daughter work with skill and confidence in the field hospitals must have been, for Marie, one of the quieter satisfactions of those difficult years. The proof that what she had tried to give her children, the conviction that the life of the mind was open to them and worth pursuing, had taken root and grown in the way she had hoped. After the war, the laboratory in Paris, which had become the Radium Institute, continued its work under Marie's direction, and she continued her own research into the properties of radioactive elements and their potential applications in medicine, and she traveled, more than she had ever traveled in the years of the great work, to conferences, and to the United States and to Brazil and to other countries where her fame had made her a figure of extraordinary symbolic importance, particularly for women who were trying to establish themselves in science, who looked at Marie Curie and saw, for perhaps the first time, the proof that the thing they wanted to do was actually possible. It is worth sitting with the particular quality of Marie Curie's relationship to her own fame, because it tells you something important about her character and about the values she held most deeply. She was not modest in the false or strategic sense, not someone who deflected praise as a social ritual while privately welcoming it, but genuinely and constitutionally oriented away from recognition and toward the work, in the same way that a compass needle is oriented away from whatever direction it was momentarily pointed and toward the one it always returns to. When journalists asked her about her life, she talked about the experiments. When admirers told her she was an inspiration, she thanked them and returned to the laboratory. When she traveled to America in 1921, receiving an extraordinary reception that included a meeting with President Harding and enthusiastic crowds wherever she appeared, she endured the attention with characteristic composure and used the occasion to secure, from the women of America who had raised money for the purpose, a gram of radium for her research, which was what she had come for, which was always what she came for. The journey to America in 1921 was an extraordinary thing in itself, an ocean voyage on the SS Olympic in the company of her two daughters and her sister Bronislawa, a journey across the Atlantic that must have felt, to a woman who had spent most of her adult life within the compass of Paris and its surrounding countryside, like a passage into a genuinely other world. The vast grey sea with its huge swells moving toward the horizon in long unbroken lines, the sky twice as big as any sky over the land, the air salt and cold and entirely clean, the horizon always the same distance away no matter how far you traveled, and the immensity of the ocean, a fact that even a thorough scientific understanding of what oceans are cannot quite prepare you for when you are actually on one, looking out at the water in all directions and understanding in your body that this is the scale of the world, that the land with its cities and its laboratories and its familiar proportions is the exception rather than the rule, and the water is the reality. She was not entirely comfortable with this symbolic role, not because she was indifferent to the struggles of women in science, but because she was, by nature and by conviction, a person who believed that the work should be the whole story, that the discoveries and the methods and the questions were what mattered, and that the person who made them, whatever their gender or nationality or circumstances, was simply the instrument through which the work happened and should not be the focus of attention. She was wrong about this, in a way, or at least incomplete, because the person who made the discoveries was not merely incidental to them. The courage and the persistence and the patience and the particular quality of intelligence that Marie brought to her work were as necessary to the discoveries as the equipment and the materials, and the story of those qualities, the story of where they came from and how they were sustained through decades of difficulty, is itself a form of knowledge, the kind of knowledge that is not about atoms and elements but about what a human life can be when it is directed with full commitment toward something genuinely important. In the last years of her life, the laboratory was her home in a way that it had always been, and she could be found there most mornings, moving through the rooms with the particular focused quiet of a person who knows exactly what they're doing and why, checking on the work of her students and colleagues, spending time at her own bench with the instruments that she had been using for 30 years, the instruments whose every characteristic she knew as well as she knew her own hands, and in these last years there was in her manner, Those who knew her reported a kind of settled quality, a quality of having arrived somewhere, of having found the place that her nature had been moving toward all along. After the war, and through the 1920s and into the 30s, Marie's life at the Radium Institute settled into a rhythm that was productive and, in its own way, deeply satisfying, a rhythm of early mornings and long days and the particular pleasure of overseeing a large and active laboratory, of watching young scientists develop and find their direction, of seeing the work that she and Pierre had begun in the leaking storeroom become a field, a recognized and richly pursued area of science with its own community of practitioners and its own journals and its own conferences, a field that was, in ways she could see clearly, beginning to have consequences in the world beyond the laboratory, consequences in medicine and in the understanding of the atom and in much else. She was not a sentimental person and she was not given to looking backward, but in the quiet hours of the laboratory, in the late afternoons when the other researchers had gone home and she was alone with the equipment and the notebooks, she would sometimes be aware of the long thread that connected this moment to the apartment in Warsaw where her father had pushed his glasses up on his forehead and read at the dinner table, and to the floating university in borrowed rooms where she had first encountered proper science, and to the cold rented room in the Latin Quarter and the shed on the Rue Lomond and all the years between that first arrival in Paris and this present moment in her own institute with her own instruments and her own students and her own shelves full of her own notebooks going back 30 years. The thread was unbroken. The direction was always the same. And what that direction had led to, when she looked around the institute and out through its windows at the world that science was beginning to transform, was more than she had imagined from Warsaw, more than the girl who had worked through physics textbooks by lamplight in the country house in Sztuki could have known she was working toward. Her daughter Irene was by now a scientist in her own right, doing research in the Radium Institute under her mother's broad supervision but with her own direction and her own questions, and the sight of Irene in the laboratory, working with the same quiet competence and the same unhurried precision that Marie had brought to the same instruments a generation earlier, was one of the quiet joys of these later years. Irene would go on, with her husband Frederick Joliot, to discover artificial radioactivity and to receive, in 1935, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, the prize that her parents had received in a different chemistry 30 years before, and the continuation of the work across a generation, the passing of the questions from parent to child and the child finding new questions in the answers the parent had found, was a form of continuity that Marie understood and valued deeply. Her health was failing, though she acknowledged this only when she absolutely had to. The years of working with radioactive materials had taken a toll on her body that she could not see and perhaps could not have prevented even if she had fully understood it, for the effects of radiation on human tissue were not known in the early years of her work, were part of what remained to be understood. And she had worked in the presence of radioactive materials with the same practical unself-consciousness that a blacksmith works in the presence of heat, because it was what the work required and because she had no reason to be afraid of something she did not yet know was dangerous. Her hands were scarred and damaged from the years of handling radioactive materials. She was often tired in ways that rest did not entirely relieve. But she continued. She died on the 4th of July 1934, at a sanatorium in the Haute-Savoie in France, of aplastic anemia, a condition of the blood that was almost certainly caused by decades of radiation exposure. She was 66 years old, and she had spent those 66 years in a state of such consistent and thorough engagement with the world, both its natural mysteries and its human challenges, that the accumulation of what she had done and learned and understood is still, nearly a century later, not entirely encompassed or absorbed. She is buried in Cisse, near Paris, alongside Pierre, and in 1995 her remains and Pierre's were moved to the Pantheon, the great mausoleum of France's national heroes, and she became the first woman to be honored there in her own right, which is the kind of distinction that she would have received with the same composed quietness she brought to all the other distinctions, acknowledging it without making much of it, because what she cared about was not the distinction but the work, and the work was already done. The notebooks she kept throughout her scientific life are still radioactive. They are held in lead-lined boxes in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and researchers who wish to consult them must sign a waiver acknowledging the radiation hazard and wear protective clothing. The polonium and radium she worked with for so many years have left their trace in the pages of her notebooks and the covers of her cookbooks and the furniture of her laboratory, a literal and physical persistence of the substance of her work, a reminder that the natural world she investigated so patiently and so thoroughly is not a passive subject but an active presence. That matter has properties that persist and operate whether or not anyone is paying attention to them, that the world goes on being itself long after the people who studied it have stopped. What she left behind was not just the discoveries, though the discoveries were immense, 2 new elements and the foundations of an understanding of radioactivity that would eventually lead to nuclear energy and to cancer treatment and to much else. What she left behind was also a way of working, a demonstration of what scientific practice looks like when it is done with full integrity and full commitment. When the measurements are taken with the greatest possible care and the results are reported with the greatest possible honesty and the conclusions are drawn only from what the evidence actually supports and the whole enterprise is sustained by a love of the questions that is deeper than any desire for recognition or reward. Let the mind rest now in the laboratory on the Rue Lomond, in the storeroom with the earthen floor and the leaking roof and the glowing dishes in the dark, in the quiet of a late evening after the day's work is done, the measurements taken and recorded, the apparatus set up for tomorrow, the questions still open, the world still full of things worth understanding. Let the cold Paris night be outside the small high windows, and let the warmth of the work be inside, the warmth of a mind that has found its proper element and is moving through it with perfect ease, following the questions wherever they lead, patient and attentive and unafraid. And let the mind move now, slowly, through all the places where Marie lived and worked and thought, through the apartment on New World Street in Warsaw where the books were on every shelf and the lamp was always lit and the cold was outside and the warmth of a family that loved each other and loved learning was inside, through the borrowed rooms of the floating university where the lectures were given in whispers and the windows were kept shuttered against discovery, through the cold rented room in the Latin Quarter where she ate little and slept little and learned everything, through the laboratory and the shed and the institute and the field hospitals near the front and the conference rooms and the lecture halls and the Sorbonne on a November afternoon when the whole city seemed to hold its breath while a woman began a lecture where her dead husband had left off. Let all of these places be present for a moment in the mind, gently and without urgency, like rooms glimpsed through open doors as you move down a long and quiet corridor, each one lit and warm and full of the specific presence of a life that was lived there, and then let them soften and recede as the corridor grows longer and the light grows gentler and the sounds of the world grow quieter, one by one, the voice of the city, the sound of equipment, the sound of pages turning, the sound of breathing in a laboratory late at night, all growing softer and more distant, and underneath them the quieter sound that is always there when the other sounds subside, the sound of the world at its most fundamental, the steady and patient hum of matter being itself, the slow and beautiful fact of existence continuing without effort or anxiety. The same force that moved through the uranium in Becquerel's laboratory and through the pitchblende in the leaking shed, the same force that glowed blue, green in the dark of the storeroom, still here, still present, still the thing that the patient and loving attention of a human mind can find and name and understand. Breathe in slowly, and let the Warsaw winter be gentle around you, the snow on the rooftops muffling the sounds of the city, the lamp on the kitchen table making its warm circle on the open pages of a physics textbook, the smell of old paper and wood smoke and the cold coming in under the door. Let the questions be many and the answers be coming, slowly and faithfully, one by one. Let the work be its own reward. Let the world be full of things worth understanding, and let the understanding of them be enough, and let it be sufficient to have looked carefully and measured precisely and reported honestly and built on what you found, and let this be the whole of a life, and let it be very good. Sleep now, as the snow falls on Warsaw, as the mist rises on the Seine, as the laboratory grows dark and the glowing dishes make their quiet light in the storeroom, as the notebooks fill and the questions multiply and the world continues to be more extraordinary and more complex and more beautiful than anyone had previously understood. Sleep in the knowledge that the work goes on, that what was discovered will persist, that the light in the dark is still there, patient and radiant and entirely sufficient. Sleep with the lamp burning low on the kitchen table and the books open and the cold outside and the warmth inside and the long future waiting, full of questions worth asking and answers worth finding, and all the time there is, for the patient and the faithful, to find them.